Hi, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to install the PingFederate ZIA connector. I already have an environment of PingFederate running and a ZIA tenant. The PingFederate environment is somewhat pre-configured, and it's pre-configured to the point that most customer environments would have their PingFederate environment configured. But in this video we're going to specifically be walking through the step-by-step process of the ZIA specific parts of that integration to ZIA. But in this PingFederate environment, I'll show you a particular parameter under this file called run.properties that's important for enabling provisioning. I already have a data store connection to an LDAP data store. And my data store just happens to be Ping directory, but in most customer deployments, it's going to be Active Directory. And then I already have an authentication policy configured in PingFederate. Every customer's deployment of PingFederate is going to have their own authentication policy, and no two authentication policies are going to look alike. But I'll provide some education of kind of the important parts to understand there. So I've got as I mentioned, my LDAP directory server environment. I'll give you just a quick overview of what that looks like. We'll configure an IDP connection from ZIA to PingFederate. And then kind of from the reverse perspective, we'll configure an SP connection from PingFederate to ZIA. That's going to leverage the ZIA connector, which provides a bunch of templated parameters for that configuration to make that easier. But that'll result in a SAML connection for single sign-on, as well as a SCIM connection for user provisioning. Then we'll execute some provisioning and execute SAML SSO. And just to emphasize, PingFederate's a very flexible, highly complex server platform, and no two customer environments are going to look the same. But there are some key parts that are required for, in our case, our particular integration. So to start, the first thing to know is to go to the pingidentity.com website in order to download the ZIA connector. And you do that by going over to this resources tab and then the software and mobile app downloads link. And on here is a number of different downloads. We want to go under the PingFederate section. And the PingFederate section is where customers would normally just download PingFederate, but also the second tab here is the add-ons to PingFederate. It's a number of different integrations and extensions to the PingFederate server. And the important one that we want here today is the Zscaler Internet Access Connector. I've already downloaded it. It's a zip file. And the important part with the zip file that you receive, sorry, just bringing up Finder here. And this will also show you where to install this connector. So here's a PingFederate folder environment or folder structure. So there's an installation folder, and then under that is a folder named PingFederate, server, default, and there's this deploy directory. Now, most customers will be very familiar with installing integration kits and connectors and the process of installing into this deploy directory. But the key thing for us today here is that the ZIA connector that you download from the pingidentity.com website, again, as a zip file, you unzip that, and within that will be this PF Zscaler ZIA quick connection jar file. But you extract that jar file and drop it into this deploy directory, which I've already done. Now, while we're here, another important thing to note that I mentioned earlier is there's this file called run.properties, and it's a number of sort of system level settings across the PingFederate server. And it's under this PingFederate bin directory. There's a number of different files here, but the one that we are interested in is this run.properties. So I'll open that quickly just to show the one property I want to point out. But as you can see, there's a number of different properties. This is where you set up things like what port should the PingFederate server be listening to. Lots of different things that we don't have to cover here. The thing I do want to cover is kind of near the bottom. Where are we? Just past it. Yeah, so this section here. So this section here talks about outbound provisioner settings. So by default, a PingFederate server has this pf.provisioner.mode set to off. And so this can be a little bit confusing if it's configured for off, yet you've configured provisioning and nothing's happening. So just note that this needs to be set to either standalone or likely in a production environment it'll be set to failover. In my case here, I'm just going to leverage standalone. So with that, I think we can log into PingFederate. Actually, I've already logged into PingFederate. And so this is my PingFederate server environment. It's running 11.2.3, which as of March 16th, 2023 is the latest version. And one of the things I want to show you here just quickly is authentication policies. And so you can get there either by this shortcut, or I'll also just show the navigation through the actual hierarchy here. So there's a authentication menu option, and then under that you see this policies option. And here under policies, you'll see that I have a authentication policy already configured, and it just happens to be called HTML with simple PCV. The details of this policy aren't all that important. Ultimately, though, this policy terminates in what's called a policy contract, which I just happen to name subject because my policy contract only returns one attribute, the subject attribute. So that's just one thing to know there. And then the other thing to be aware of is I have a connection to a data store already configured as well. So that's under System, this first option, data and credential stores, and then data stores. So here's my connection to my data store. It happens to be Ping directory. This is where your customer would have a connection to Active Directory, for example. And while we're talking about the directory, let me flip over to my LDAP browser. And this is just a utility to visualize an LDAP directory. And if you're not familiar, directories are kind of a tree hierarchical structure, starting with a root node, and then it's got these different branches. And so in this case, the parts that are important to us here for this video is the root is DC equals example, comma DC equals com. And then we're under this branch OU equals Zscaler users. And here is where we will be leveraging the directory structure of groups and users to provide provisioning into ZIA. So the first two nodes here are groups. So this is a group called ZS groups. And the next one is a group called ZS users. And these are going to be used to tell PingFederate what users and what groups to provision. Basically, PingFederate will look to see what users and groups are members of these two groups. So the ZS groups would hold a list of groups. In our case, we're just going to use one, which is referring to this other group. And that's going to now tell PingFederate, okay, look at ZS groups, see which groups are members of that group, because those are the groups we're going to provision to ZIA. So we're going to provision the ZS users as a group to ZIA. Sort of separately, but obviously related, we have the second group called ZS users. And here I've got two members of this group. So you can see there's this user.0 and user.1. That corresponds to the next two objects, user.0, user.1. And I've got this third user. We'll add this user into the group after we set up the provisioning. So here I've just got some pre-populated user information. Some key parts to this is that this parameter here, UID, which has a value of user.0, in an Active Directory environment, this is equivalent to SAM account name, or essentially the Windows username. And thing just to note here is that this username doesn't have a domain at the end, which we'll need for ZIA. So I've populated the email address to be user.0, same username, at the domain that is registered in my ZIA tenant, which in this case is pf.efas.xyz. All right. So I think maybe the last step while we're at PingFederate that I'm going to point out is, so just to summarize, so far we have the ZIA connector installed in PingFederate, but we haven't configured it yet. So next I'll be setting up that configuration or the integration between ZIA and PingFederate. But while we're here, one of the things I'm going to do is just download a signing certificate. So ZIA will need to be configured with a signing certificate. I happen to have this one already created. So I'm just going to go ahead and export it. And certificate only. Great. Export that. We'll come back to that in a second. So now over at my ZIA environment, just to orient you with what I have, I've used this for quite a time. So there's a number of different identity providers. You can ignore all of these. We're going to create a net new identity provider, which I'll start doing now. So this new identity provider, it's going to be called PingFederate. And I'm going to set this enabled so I don't forget later. SAML portal URL, we'll grab that in a second. We can fill out name ID as the value here. I just downloaded that certificate, so let's get that uploaded. Now, ZIA requires that the file name ends in a .pem extension. And so all we really need to do, so PingFederate doesn't download that and with that extension, so all we need to do is just rename the end of the file here to .pem and we'll be able to upload that. Okay, so the certificate's installed. We've given it a name, set the name ID, set it to enabled. Really the only other key part at this point is the SAML portal URL. Now, SAML portal URL isn't provided sort of in a clear way in PingFederate, but it's rather simple to find. It's a combination of really two values. And the first value you find under system server base URL. So that's part of the value. So copy that in. That's where it starts. I happen to be running this on localhost. In a production environment, customers would have generally a fully qualified domain name. Now that's the start of the URL. We need the end of the URL. You can actually find under this sort of documentation link, the second option down is this IDP endpoints. And this brings up just a pop-up that shows various relative URL paths for different protocol endpoints. So starts off with single logout, but this section here is where we'll grab our value, single sign-on. But depending on what kind of federation protocols you're using, there's a number of different endpoints in this view. But we really just want this one. And this is where ZIA will be sending SAML authentication requests. So that's the full URL. Let's choose PingFederate while we're here. We don't need to change anything else. So I'm going to save that. Oops, I forgot to choose the domain. So we're going to be using this domain, pf.efas.xyz. All right, I'll save that. All right, so here's our new IDP. I'm going to edit that now in order to turn on skim provisioning. And by doing that, I'll receive the space URL and a bearer token. We'll need that in a little bit when we're configuring PingFederate. All right, so we will proceed with actually creating the connection. So under applications, there happens to be the shortcut to SP connections, but you can get there under integration as well, SP connections. And we'll create the connection. In our case, we're going to use a template for this connection because we're going to use the ZIA connector. As you can see, I can select that here. Oh, and the other thing I forgot to do is download a metadata file. So let's do that while we're here. So I've downloaded the metadata file. So now on PingFederate, we can upload that file. Go next. Generally, I'm going to be skipping over a number of steps here that aren't specific to the ZIA integration, but I'll try to talk about things as we go. But this connection type is now pre-configured for both SSO as well as outbound provisioning. On the general info tab, this is where customers define things like entity IDs, and they give their connection a friendly name. So this just comes pre-populated as login.zscaler.net. We could call this just something more easy to remember, ZIA. One thing to point out is there's a little bit of disconnect between the metadata file that ZIA produces and the assertion consumer service URL it includes in SAML authn requests. Some detail there. Ultimately, all you really need to know is that at runtime, ZIA is including this port number 443, which is the default port for HTTPS. So generally, it's not included because it's optional. But ZIA is including it in its assertion consumer service URL at runtime. And PingFederate's a stickler for things matching up exactly. So we just need to change that by adding the port 443. And we'll proceed. So now we've got this Browser SSO section. We'll get into credentials and then outbound provisioning. There's a couple of steps here in the Browser SSO connection, just to give you a little bit of orientation of the kind of the model of the wizard in PingFederate. It's very hierarchical in that we're under this kind of area of SP connections, and we're configuring a particular SP connection. Now we're going to step down a layer deeper and configure Browser SSO, and so you'll see that up here in the breadcrumbs. So now we're under Browser SSO. Now, since a number of things are already configured, as we get here, the wizard just kind of skips us ahead to the parts that still need some configuration. So SAML profiles is already configured, assertion lifetime, don't need to worry about. Just need to get here to the assertion creation, which brings us down one level deeper. So now we're under Browser SSO assertion creation. So in here, again, the wizard stepped us a couple of steps forward, and now this is the key step that we're on, the authentication source mapping step. 9 times out of 10, customers are going to be using this authentication policy mapping. In the past, PingFederate supported just this direct kind of adapter mapping, but it's not used very much with customers anymore. So we'll use this new authentication policy. And I mentioned earlier I had an authentication policy configured. It terminated in an authentication policy contract called subject. And so by selecting that particular authentication policy contract, that basically will say whenever a request comes into this SP connection, find the authentication policy that terminates with subject and go execute that authentication policy. So that's how we link authentication policies to connections. And again, I mentioned that this authentication policy contract, which could have been called anything, just happens to be returning just a simple single value of subject, which is why I decided to call it just the policy contract itself subject. All right, so proceeding. Now, when users log in my case, they're just going to enter a username without a domain extension. And therefore, that username itself isn't sufficient for the SSO or for the SAML assertion. And this step allows us to tell PingFederate, okay, let's retrieve some additional attributes before populating the attributes in the SAML assertion. Basically, let's take the data that came from the authentication and query an LDAP data store to pull out some other data. So I'm going to choose this middle option for doing that. And then we need to add an attribute source. And here, as we looked at previously, I already had a data store configured. It just happened to be called ping directory. And we just give this a name here. All right, so then when searching a directory, we need to tell PingFederate where to look in that directory, what attributes to retrieve. The next step will tell PingFederate how to actually sort of query, what's the actual query to use when making a request against the directory. So here I need a base DN, and since I had already run through this once before, my browser is being very helpful in telling me what base DN I used previously, which happens to be the right base DN. And again, just to go back to that, that is OU equals Zscaler users under DC equals example, comma, DC equals com. And so that's this value here. Now, the attribute we want is the email attribute. So we're going to tell PingFederate, okay, when returning data from the directory, return a mail attribute. And here's where we set up the filter. And again, I mentioned when users authenticate, they're going to be entering something like user.0. And so we need to find the user object that has a UID equal to what they enter at the authentication screen. So this is going to be UID equals, and then it tells you the possible values I can choose below, which just happens to be in this case 1. which is the subject attribute from the authentication policy contract. And here's where we're telling PingFederate, okay, now when issuing a SAML assertion, what value to populate in the SAML subject, or often at Zscaler we refer to this as the name ID. PingFederate just happens to refer to it as SAML subject. And so we're going to take a value from this LDAP data store that we just configured, and we're going to use the mail attribute that we just chose. All right, so now we've got attribute sources and user lookup configured under this authentication policy mapping step of the wizard. We're not going to use failsafe attribute sources. This is used to tell PingFederate if something fails to find a user, customers can configure a default set of attributes to send over. But in our case, we're going to say if there's some issue, we're just going to abort and throw an error. All right, so as you can see, I'm just kind of stepping through some screens here. There's summary screens. It's important, I'll emphasize, to always be clicking done buttons where you can. You can navigate by clicking up in this header area or obviously around the other menu. But if you're ever in a configuration and you do that, you'll end up losing your configuration. The way to persist configuration is generally through clicking done and next. And then at the very end, there should be a button that says save, and that's ultimately when the configuration will get persisted. All right, so search and creation, we just completed that, so we can proceed. Protocol settings, this is a number of SAML specific protocol level settings. Again, since we're using a quick connection template, we don't need to configure anything there. So proceed, summary screen, and now we're back up to kind of this main path where we're configuring the SP connection. We have completed the configuration for the SAML Browser SSO, minus, I guess, one related step, which is telling PingFederate how to sign the assertion. So that's what we do here. And previously I had downloaded the signing certificate, or from ZIA's perspective, the signature verification certificate. So I'm going to make sure to choose that same certificate here so that PingFederate will sign using the same cert that we downloaded previously. So the credential step is done, and so really the last step now that we'll get into is outbound provisioning. So we'll configure provisioning, and the first thing here we do is set a base URL and bearer token, which we had previously brought up by enabling skim provisioning. So I'm going to copy that base URL here. And the bearer token. All right, so that completed the configuration to tell PingFederate when calling ZIA skim endpoint, how do you authenticate, or what's the endpoint and how do you authenticate? And so now what we do is we configure a provisioning channel. And what this is the configuration that tells PingFederate, okay, how to monitor an LDAP directory to find new users or users with changed attributes, and how do you find them and provision them over to ZIA. So we give this channel a name. I'll just use what I've used previously, local ping directory. And then we need to choose a source. Once again, I'm going to choose that pre-existing data store connection that I have called ping directory. This source settings page is a number of settings that 99% of the time don't need to be modified. So we can just skip over this. And now here we're at source location. So this is where we tell PingFederate where to look in the directory and what rules we want to use to actually find users and groups. So similarly, as we did before, we're going to leverage this node here as being the base of where to search the directory. So paste that in. So OU equals Zscaler users, DC equals example, DC equals com. Now below that, we have these two sections, users and groups. The first is telling PingFederate, okay, what are the rules to find users to provision? Second one is, what are the rules to find groups to provision? And so in both of these cases, we're just going to use this group DN option You can also use an LDAP filter, but things get a little bit more complicated. It's generally just easier to use groups here. And again, since I had already configured this once before, my browser is helping me out. And this is the setting I used before, ZS users, under the OU of Zscaler users, DC equals example, DC equals com. And so that is referring to this group here. So ZS users, in which we have 2 users as members. And so that's how I'll find users to provision. Now for groups, again, we're going to use this previously configured setting, ZS groups, Zscaler users. So you can see that here, ZS groups under Zscaler users, example, com. All right, so we've completed that step. Moving forward, really one of the last things that we need to do here is review the attribute mapping. So this is PingFederate going to be querying the local directory. And these are the attributes this column here, it's going to find in the directory. And so there's a UID attribute, display name, department number, mail, etc. Give a name SN for first and last name. But for ZIA, these are the fields that need to be populated: username, display name, department. And so this is saying that PingFederate is just going to pull out any value that's in this department number attribute and populate it in ZIA's department attribute. Now all of this by default in my case is fine, except for this UID attribute, which again doesn't include a domain on it. So I want to change that to mail. And remove UID. A few different settings here. In our case, we're just going to do a straight mapping of mail into the ZIA username attribute. But there's a bunch of things that customers can do in terms of manipulating strings and things like that. So yeah, so we made that change. So username will now be populated with mail. So now we'll click next. And we're getting close to the end here. And so there's really 2 steps left. We're going to set this connection as active, and this channel as active, and then we'll set the SP connection as enabled. Before I do that, I just want to make sure I've got everything kind of finished over here, which is, yeah, everything should be configured here on the connection. I just want to activate this before we turn on PingFederate. All right, so we've activated that. While we're here, flip over to users. And I've got a list of users just from previous tests and things. 16 total users. Our users are going to show up at the bottom because they start with a U in their username. So right now they're not here. Likewise, under groups, we don't see groups. We don't see the group ZS users, which will show up here in a second. All right, and then one other thing I'm going to do, although not necessarily required, but under the PingFederate here, under PingFederate log directory, there's a number of different log files. Let me just double check what we have right now. Yeah, so this provisioner log is going to be interesting to monitor. So I'm going to bring that up, and sort of in the background, I'll see some activity once we enable the channel and the connection. All right, so we're completing the configuration for the SP connection, specifically under provisioning. So we're going to set this provisioning channel as active. Down at the bottom, click done. Click done again. And so now we're back at sort of the main path. Again, we've completed SAML configuration for Browser SSO, selected a signing certificate, completed the configuration for outbound provisioning. So the next step is this kind of final step of the connection wizard, where we can review the summary of configuration. So this shows you everything that's configured in this connection. So if there's any any issues with integration, this is kind of a handy page to go to just to see the entirety of all the configuration set. And then right here, this toggle here sets this connection to enabled. So we'll turn that on, and then again, it's really important to get down to this last save button and click save. If you've set up a bunch of configuration and never clicked a save button, again, you likely are going to lose that configuration. All right, so I saved that. That turned on provisioning, and so you'll see some activity here. And I set up this provisioner to run every 20 seconds, so hopefully we'll see some activity here in the next roughly 10 seconds now. All right, so it's found some things, and it's not totally intuitive, but it created two objects here. For some reason, it doesn't show login for creating the group, but it created two users, and this is just how it's referring to these two users. I think maybe this is the record for creating the group. But anyway, so it did some provisioning, and we didn't get any errors. So that's the good point there. And so on user management, if I refresh this page, we should see two users listed. All right, so before we had 16 users, now we've got 18, so user.0 and user.1 showed up. And you can see that they are members of this group called ZS users. And if we go over to the groups tab, you can see we've provisioned ZS users. So that's great. Just to show provisioning, making a change. So we have under this ZS users group, we have two users, but I've got a third user called user.2. So we are going to add that user to the ZS users group. And the way I'm doing this is just in my environment. Your customer's environment likely is not using this particular tool, but the general concept is the same. All right, so now that group has a third user. I'm going to add some lines here. And in a second, we should see another create event. Great, so created that user. All right, so then the last thing I want to show is actually executing single sign-on. So I'm going to open up the Zscaler utility or client. And I'm going to log in as user.0. So now ZIA is directing me over to my PingFederate server to authenticate. So this just happens to be the login screen of my PingFederate server. And I'm completing authentication. And getting connected. There we go. All right, and just to show kind of the last of this, so from ip.zscaler.com, you'll see that I am connected to ZIA, logged in as this user. Great, that's the end of this video. I hope it was helpful. And if you have any questions, my name is Eric Fazenden. You can reach out to me. Thank you.